This is the RDU on Stage podcast. I'm Lauren Van Hemert, your host, and on this episode, we are talking more about the 19th Amendment Project. Hi everyone, I'm Lauren Van Hemert, and this is the third episode in a series of episodes exploring the 19th Amendment Project, a collection of plays commissioned by Burning Coal Theater and co-produced by the League of Women Voters and 12 other Triangle area theater companies. In 1848, 68 women and 32 men signed a document known as the Declaration of Sentiments in Seneca Falls, New York. Some might argue that this milestone, which took place 72 years prior to the ratification of the 19th Amendment, was the start of the organized women's movement. 1848 also marks another historic event, the ending of the Mexican-American War in favor of the United States, which not only added over 500,000 square miles of land to the U.S. territory, but also established a border between the United States and Mexico. Elaine Romero, an Arizona-based playwright who has been working with the Justice Theater Project to develop her play A Sentiment, says her Mexican-American heritage and growing up and living close to the border informs every aspect of her work. And that is where our conversation begins.
There are big conversations going on right now about race and about white gaze and white lens. And I think BIPOC people also, we have our own lenses. And my lens, of course, is the Mexican-American lens. And that lens is something, even when I write about characters who are not particularly listed as being Mexican-American, I always think of them in some covert way because they're coming from me. They have some of my DNA. For example, many, many years ago, one of my early short plays was a play called If Susan Smith Could Talk. And it was about a woman who had drowned her children in the family car, and she had blamed a Black man. It was a big news story at the time. And I had written this short play riffing on what had happened. And I remember looking back and saying, well, she's kind of Medea, but she's also La Llorona being the woman who drowns her children in the river, and then she haunts the rivers of the Southwest in Mexico and even South America. She's a myth and a legend. And so I think it very much informs how we see the world. And living here on the border in Arizona, in a community that's truly bicultural. Tucson is a bicultural community. It's Mexican and it's American. There's a sign about a block from my house that says 25 miles of the best Mexican food north of the border. And that is a true statement. And we have Day of the Dead, which is a big celebration in the fall. And in that celebration, El Dia de los Muertos, Americans too, everybody celebrates it together. And it's, and you could say, oh, that's been co-opted, but I've seen it hasn't. I would at least say when we first started doing that as a community and we had that procession, it was very organic and people would just mourn publicly for people they'd lost, whether they were Mexican or not Mexican. And so I think there are ways in which Tucson has become this place where the two cultures fuse very naturally in a really organic, beautiful way. And my writing is also part of that fusion.
I'm not even sure how to put this, but do you feel like living near the border that your heritage is magnified or amplified in some way?
That's a really good question. And I would have thought that was true. But, it's interesting. When I went to Chicago and I was somewhat the playwright in exile, the Tucson, the Arizona playwright in exile, I realized that I was invoking the border still, if not in a more powerful way. And even on retreats, I've been very fortunate to receive retreats in different locations where I've gone to write. And in those places, the border has been with me. So, and I was raised close to the California border. The Tijuana, San Diego border was the closest border to me. And my mother is a native of New Mexico, and our family has a 500-year history in that region. And so, in a way, in my early work, I developed frequently in Texas. I still work there a lot as a playwright. It's interesting to see as you grow as a playwright where you're a place where people are interested in your work. And in my experience, thinking about the issues that matter to me or what matters to me in the world, the border comes forth. And there's a way in which, because it's so much part of my consciousness, that even in Chicago, I write about the border. Even in a beach in Florida, I write about the border. The border follows me. And, she created me. So I think there's a reason that she follows me. And I would just add that not every play I have is particularly about the border or about politics. The particular play that I'm developing with Burning Coal and with Jerry Sipp at the Justice Theater is called A Sentiment, and it has to do with the 19th Amendment. So it's you could say, oh, that's a diversion or that's far away, and yet I think there are ways in which, if you expand your concept of the border, what historically was the border between men and women, and that border still exists, and we still toy with that border and push that border and try to break pieces of that border.
When you look at advocacy as a playwright, as a writer, do you feel like there is an immediacy when you write? I feel like with all of these plays, there's such an immediacy and urgency to them.
Oh, yes. I mean, it's a battle cry. It is the moment where, hey, look, this is what's going on. And I haven't had a chance to interact with other playwrights who are part of this project, although I'm friends with multiple playwrights who have been commissioned by the theater. It's amazing the group of women they've found. But I find myself with every piece thinking about this has to be out there right now. And in the moments where I think, well, where I'm getting feedback, people are thinking, oh, this play is not relevant, or we don't know about this play. I have a play called Wetback. And that play is about a hate crime against an immigrant. And when I wrote that play, people said, oh, nobody would just kill an immigrant for no reason. That would never happen. I took that play all over this United States. It went to New York 3 or 4 times as a reading. I had readings in Chicago. I had readings on the border, and the feedback was that. And sadly, time proved the play to be true. And that's one of those cases where you hope you're wrong. You hope that time will prove that you were overreacting. And unfortunately, time has frequently proven that I'm underreacting, or that we as society that we've had our eyes closed. And I think when it comes to women, we don't want to admit what we've done. We don't want to. We don't want to know what we do. Because if we knew, it would be so painful to understand what we've done. It would be so painful that we've held back the people who love us, the people who birthed us, that we've held them back. And how do we feel about that? That's a reckoning. It may be coming in a couple months, it may be coming in a couple years, but that's something that is going to make the earth tremble if we ever decide to truly own what we've done. I mean, if you look at what's happened in the United States versus other countries, we're behind in terms of our relationship to women. We're behind in electing women leaders. We're behind in pay equality. We're behind in so many ways. And, I sometimes when I reflect on that, I think, is that because of who we're descended from as a country, at least partly, the bigger story of the Puritans and the bigger story of people coming here for religious freedom. And that other story, I don't know. My mother told me when I was a kid, George Washington is not your father. Of course, we're proud to be American. But basically, she was telling me the story of 1848, because 1848 is a very important story in my life, because that's the year that the US invaded northern Mexico and took over a third of the country. And my family was part of that. They were living in that third of the country.
I feel like for so many young feminists who are involved in this new wave feminist movement today, there are so many of them who just seem so unaware of the history of the women's movement and the women who came before them and who truly laid the foundation to make this new wave of the women's movement even possible? There's so much talk about erasure, especially when it comes to women of color in the women's movement. So, do you feel like our history has been lost?
Yes, I feel that the erasure of who has come before, whether it be women, whether it be in the world of theater, whether it be in all BIPOC communities, is one of the primary maladies of this country. And that erasure and that forgetting is going to create great pain. And I spend every day trying to understand why it's happening. You go into a new institution and suddenly they're fleshing out everything that was ever known of that institution. Like somehow a blank slate is what's needed in order to move forward. And we can't even acknowledge people who built the institutions that we're now inhabiting. We can't even like put their name on a door. I mean, there have been fights about founding artistic directors not even being able to have a plaque on the door anymore because the new folks felt like, oh no, we can't put a nod to them. We're doing the new thing now. And somehow, like inheriting things doesn't come with a responsibility. And I think that I've seen it, in fact, every aspect of society. And I think in the federal level, it's been devastating. Having no institutional memory of the federal government is devastating. Having no institutional memory in general. And I wish it were just happening in one space. I wish it were just women. But no, it's happening across the board. And I think it's incumbent upon us, before we forget everything, to really ask some hard questions about why we think this is necessary. Why is the disruption of having no memory essential to us thinking we can move forward? Because it is just, in my mind, wrong thinking. And when it comes to women, for one, it makes it easy to erase older women and their efforts. It makes it easy to not make parity, not only in gender, but in age. Because if you were really looking at, in artistic endeavors, for example, well, I won't just make opportunities for emerging writers, but what about all the women who've been writing all this time who've opened these doors? Do we slam their toe in the door or not? And that's an ethical question. And I think it's an ethical question that we have across the board in this country, in every institution, been unwilling to look at. And I think that in many ways is our demise. And I hope we can, perhaps a project like this will help us look back. And you may be aware that first wave feminism has always been considered problematic. And the reason it has been, at least in my lifetime in studying first wave feminists, I had published my first poem when I was 14, and it had to do with Susan B. Anthony. So I go back with this subject. And in looking at this, first wave feminists were seen as wanting to advocate for the rights of women. And that somehow, in their advocacy, instead of seeing like a generosity of, I fight for all human rights, they were often pitted against the rights of African Americans. And an unfortunate historical break happened. And one morning, after having been commissioned to write this play, the name Lucretia Mott came into my mind. I couldn't remember who she was. I knew I'd studied her as a child, I'd studied her as an adult, but I had no idea who she was. And when I looked her up, I saw she was both an abolitionist and one of the co-authors of the Declaration of Sentiments. And I thought, wow, in her body, in her person, she brings together these two aspects of social justice. And that's how I fell in love with Lucretia Mott and decided to write her story in a sentiment.
I I love that. So when you do write about a historical figure like her and historical events, how important is it for you to tell the story factually, and how much artistic license can you take?
I think that for me, I'm interested in the semblance of what's true, what the audience feels is true. And I think when you go down the rabbit hole of fact, this is factual, this isn't, not only do you bind yourself up in your mind and you find, reports that are conflicting or things like that, but you also run in to not really owning the story and the characters and making them your own, which really, really upends your ability to write a good play, or in this case, it's now a movie, to write your film. So for me, I have to give myself freedom. Trust me, I know the facts. I study the facts and I know what they are. And I know when I'm moving things around for the sake of a dramatic story. Because history is not inherently dramatic, it has to be shaped. And any playwright who thinks that they're not shaping, just the process of editing is shaping. Just the process of choosing this and not choosing that. Our minds are making a narrative and they're making a story. And I don't even call it artistic license. I mean, it is everything we're doing is narrative. It's fiction. Nobody knows exactly what Lucretia Mott said to her husband. I know he signed the Declaration of Sentiments. And when I saw that, the Declaration of Sentiments is based on the Declaration of Independence. That's what the women at Seneca Falls presented to put forth their case for women's rights. And to see that her husband had signed that, I was so moved by that. And I thought, I wonder what happened. I wonder what their conversation could have been. What might have happened that he chose to sign it? And it's such a strongly stated document. What did it feel like? What ripples would it have sent in their relationship? And those are the questions that I asked in order to write the play. Because plays come from what if questions. What if he didn't just sign it and say, hey, honey, here it is? What if there were a conversation? What if it felt like our own relationship is at stake as you make this proclamation about what you think women need? And what does that say about what I've done or what I haven't done?
I totally agree. And what I love so much about Burning Coal Theater and Justice Theater Project is that nobody seems to approach and tackle these quote unquote history plays like they do. They seem to really have a knack for telling these types of stories. You also teach dramaturgy and you are a professor. So, can you talk to me about the evolution of the history play from Shakespeare to contemporary plays like yours?
I mean, it's interesting because Shakespeare, he was the ultimate person who shaped and reshaped historical characters for his own dramatic ends. And I think that I take great inspiration in that. I recently wrote an academic paper about some work I've been doing, and I was talking about form and the idea of generative dramaturgy and what that means. And in working with that paper, the first person I alluded to was Shakespeare. So I think that's interesting you ask about that. And I think that, we also look at Anna Devere Smith, who, really worked specifically with interviews and the idea of embodying different characters through interviews and not changing the text. And giving birth to interview-based work in which text was not altered. Although I will give credit to Emily Mann for her play Still Life, which I believe also does that. So there was a history of that prior to Anna Devere Smith. But I will say that there became a moment in time where all the idea was, if we could just get the voices from the real people, it'll be more pure. And so all of us, not just the playwrights known for this, have been commissioned over the years to write interview-based plays and just do an edit job as a way to get some kind of idea that this was a truer voice. And I think that, many theater projects like Tectonic Theater, they became known for really shaping things and working with basically interview text. And then, of course, myself, I've been commissioned over the years to do the same. And in my own personal journey, I have found that although I can be inspired by interviews, that I also have an artistry and I also have a voice. And I know I've got a talent for poetic language. I know that that's part of the DNA of me as a playwright. And, people who are being interviewed, you can ask great questions and maybe you can get to the heart of something that's true and really use it and find a piece of gold. Or maybe you find somebody who you haven't asked the right questions or they don't have the right level of vulnerability and they just never give you what you need. And I think that all these different theaters across the country have made different discoveries about the limits of interview-based material and also how it can still be used for inspiration. So that's been my own personal journey around it. And then with historical pieces like Before Death Comes for the Archbishop, which has to do with my 1848, the invasion of northern Mexico by the United States, I really learned, I basically taught myself how I wanted to interact with history. That sometimes it's just some small detail that's attractive or an event. But what I'm interested in, whether a play is contemporary or historical, is how is the individual, the human being, and the human being that that person relates to or loves, how are they swept up in a moment of history? What is the background of history that dances behind each of our lives? And I'm so intrigued by that. And I think with this couple I found, with Lucretia Mott and her husband, it was this moment to say, they are two people who I decided they love the hell out of each other. I thought that's what I want. They love each other like crazy. They're abolitionists. They both have a moral center. They gave up their assets at some point because they did not want to benefit from the work of slaves. What does that mean? They are against a background of history. And so I'm interested in that. Like, what is the background of history I'm living in? I may just be worried about going to work and living in a day, and yet I'm against a background in history. We are experiencing a background in history right now of the pandemic, of huge political change, of huge social change. This is a moment that's not going to be easily forgotten. We all are in this moment of history together. I always think about the Greeks, of course, because they're the great. The idea is that there are prophets in the world, and one doesn't want to call oneself a prophet. But, if you pay enough attention to what's happening socially in the world, you can be somewhat predictive. I mean, great politicians are predictive. Great politicians are able to look at something and say, flash forward to 10 years from now, flash forward to 15 years from now, and this is how that plays out. And the best politicians that I've admired have been able to do that. They've been able to prognosticate outcomes. And I think playwrights do the same thing. And I think the theaters that engage with this work around social justice, they're also prognosticating, and they're interested in producing work that speaks to where not only where we are in this moment or where we've been, but they dare to say where we might be going. The future's not fixed, and each of us has the ability to affect that future. So if we really understand that, we're going to take a moment and we're going to say, how do I push forward a future I want to see and not just be a victim of where things are headed? That's the question that political theater asks. And that's the reason that I love to dance with it and write it. And I always think that the personal story is what really tells the story. I always think that as playwrights, we're saying, this is the moment we live in, this is what happened, and this is who we were. And that if art doesn't make that imprint of who we were, that moment of history is just forgotten. And even in a play that talks about the past, we're talking about the present. I mean, a sentiment is about the present. We could say, oh, it's a historical play, and we can get comfortable. Oh, like, look at what they did to women. They were so horrible. Or we could reflect on the declaration of sentiments in its full and how we have lived up to or not lived up to what the women have asked for, and how their voices continue to echo. And why is that? And how can we do a better job? I think that they're challenging us from history to talk about the present.
What do you think Lucretia Mott would say about the women's movement and the Black Lives Matter movement today if she were still around?
We don't want to speak for others, but I think her heart would rejoice because those were the two movements she cared about. And I'm crying, so you can't see because this is an audio. But I'm so deeply moved how in her moment in history, she saw that she wanted rights for all human beings, and how her heart was dedicated to being an abolitionist, and how that helped her understand how she wanted to advocate for the rights of women. And she didn't see those two things as mutually exclusive. May all of us who are listening to this never think of two things as being mutually exclusive when it comes to issues around justice. Wouldn't that be great?
Romero's play A Sentiment premieres this Saturday, August 22nd. I'll put additional information in the episode notes. If you like what you've heard today, please consider subscribing to this podcast, become a patron of the show, follow us on social media, or visit us online at www.rduonstage.com. Until next time, I'll see you at the theater.